This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
My research interest in home draws from and sits itself within several disciplines: architectural history, feminist and queer theory, as well as geographies of sexualities. Writing from within a school of architecture and inspired by feminist scholars who have investigated gender and home over the past few decades, my project focuses on the ways in which sexuality is spatialized in the domestic sphere. Specifically, I focus on the homes of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, or LGBTQ, Londoners. I admit and hope that my project is a rather queer architectural history of home. Research has shown that architecture in many ways, quote, frames our sexual lives, provides images of them, and to some extent limits them, end quote. Links between sexuality, gender, and sex can be found in almost any architectural space. LGBTQ identity in particular is intimately related to space and the objects that fill it. Theorist Sarah Ahmed reminds us that to invoke sexual orientation is to use a spatial metaphor. If we know where we are when we turn this way or that way, then we are orientated. To be orientated is also to be turned towards certain objects, those that help us find our way, she notes. As a place where sexuality is commonly orientated, the domestic sphere offers a spatial confluence of LGBTQ identity, architecture, and the everyday. In light of the amount of research that has considered the links between social identity and space, it is surprising that so few scholars have questioned the ways in which sexual identity and home coalesce. Like a handful of scholars before me, in focusing on non-normative sexualities in home, I aim to interrogate the stability of domesticity. In this, I respond to architectural historian Gülsüm Badar's call to turn domesticity on its head. She states, and this is a block quote, "The normative structure of domesticity has largely been the single-family household, governed by heterosexual relationships, with man as the head of the household and women as the caretaker. Once other figures of masculinity and femininity enter the scene, both the notion of a normative unified subject and the norm of domesticity are challenged, for these others are bound to cite the norm differently." End quote. To offer an alternative representation of domesticity in my research, I give agency to the small-scale interventions and everyday actions of Londoners, specifically by highlighting homemaking practices of 40 LGBTQ households, which draw from interviews with both home occupiers, singles and couples, as well as domestic tradespeople that work in other homes belonging to sexual minorities. So in total, I interviewed 58 people. In so doing, I attempt to complicate one problematic overarching regime of power that dominates our cultural value system: the idea that a specific version of heterosexuality is the default or normal identity against which all other sexualities are measured. This is known in queer theory as heteronormativity, which is the first of two theoretical concepts I want to discuss today. Human geographer Gavin Brown defines heteronormativity, quote, as the process that socially construct a privileged heterosexuality and related binary understandings of gender over homosexuality and unconventional presentations of gender, end quote. In other words, heteronormativity is, quote, a set of norms that make heterosexuality seem natural or right, end quote, in contrast to the binary opposite, homosexuality. Thus, heteronormativity prevents any other sexuality from being taken for granted or going unmarked. The concept of heteronormativity implies that space is socially produced. Instead of theorizing space as a priori heteronormative, scholars have shown the ways in which space mimics heteronormative human actions. That is, heteronormativity is the direct result of the actions of people who inhabit space, which has the result of oppressing minorities. In other words, it can be changed with human action. Although perhaps not widely found in the everyday lexicon, heteronormativity is certainly something many LGBTQ people experience at several stages and to varying degrees over the course of their lives. Heteronormativity is not the same thing as heterosexuality. Heteronormativity is a larger concept that relates to a specific model of the monogamous and heterosexual couple who form a nuclear family. By its very nature of being normative, it raises certain alarm bells. But despite this, my work and the work of others in queer theory seeks to challenge the narrow and restricting nature of heteronormativity. To be clear, I do not take issue with everyday lived heterosexuality. In fact, I would even speculate that a similar study with those that identify with the everyday mainstream would equally work to destabilize heteronormative ideology at home. Recognizing the problems of heteronormativity, queer approaches have recently moved towards a model of sexual diversity, which moves away from a binary of normal-abnormal. Therefore, rather than make claims that for a monolithic representation of minority domesticity, in order to challenge this, my work works to celebrate the diversity of LGBTQ homes. I argue sexuality plays out in multiple ways, which collectively offer challenges to the idea of the heteronormative home. To embrace this complexity is to acknowledge, in the words of historian Matt Cook, that, quote, queer identities and identifications are neither unitary nor exclusive, end quote. In order to work at improving inequality for sexual minorities, the best place to start is on the home front, a place most people are familiar with and can relate to, a space where conservative ideals are most firmly rooted, and a site in which change is slow to come. Heteronormativity and the intimately connected concept of patriarchy has a long history in the domestic sphere. Throughout modern history, the home has been, to quote historian Christopher Reed, the main arena for the enforcement of conventional divisions of masculinity and femininity, along with their complement heterosexuality, end quote. But that is not to suggest LGBTQ people have been unable to engage with sexual identity within this space. The modern home has also been a staging ground for rebellion against these norms. Literary critic Martin Doyne notes how, following World War II, both American governmental policy and suburban architectural home design put forward a campaign to establish the heterosexual single-family household as the primary model. The suburban family home was marketed and established in the American mindset as a place of success, a place where young heterosexual families could move forward out of the war years. The architecture of the home also reflected the single-family unit. The individual privacy of cellular rooms. Sorry, I think I'm one slide behind. No, that's okay. Sorry, the individual privacy of cellular rooms gave way to the modern open-plan design, which better facilitated family privacy and interaction between family members. Stay-at-home mothers could easily watch children while working in the open-plan kitchen. Historian Richard Hornsey uncovers how the post-war period in London saw a similar focus on the private family home. The home was, quote, presented as a space of national citizenship, important for scoring social order and psychological stability, end quote. A place that needed to be the focus of attention in order to reinvest national pride in prosperity in a badly damaged country. Exhibitions like Britain Can Make It and the South Bank exhibition established the motto, reform the home, reform the nation, and deployed modern architecture to initiate social change. A look at a project not discussed in these two texts, from the 1944 Central Housing Advisory Committee's Design for Dwellings, shown here, shows the way in which British planners designed modern homes with the heterosexual nuclear family ideology in mind, one based on home as the female space of reproduction, wherein the husband does little work. In the plan, the mother is relegated to the kitchen quarters, preparing a meal and doing dishes, while the children wait patiently at a table and the husband sits relaxing in the lounge with his back to the family. Despite the passage of several decades and the efforts of feminists worldwide, one can see surprising similarities in a recent advertisement found on the London Underground for ESPN Sports. In it, a husband sits at a kitchen table perfecting a model of the English Football Association Cup out of mashed potato, while his wife in the background looks bemused. We are led to believe that this scene is enacted in a typical English home. Bangers and mash, HP sauce, and separate water taps are all truly British. The representation quality may have improved, but the subject matter of the advertisement could date to the immediate post-war period or even earlier. Hornsey observes that though the home was and continues to be an important space of conservative heterosexual national pride, the increasing presence of homosexuals in urban centers meant the exclusivity of home was re-evaluated in Britain. In the decade following the 1959 Wolfenden Report, which saw the partial decriminalization of same-sex intimacy in private, the home became the only legal site in which queer identity could be expressed. It is clear that in the post-war period, the heterosexual nuclear family home became a contested terrain, a place where non-heterosexual identity was suppressed, but also a place where it was legitimized. While such architectural interventions as the open plan and conventions such as the larger master bedroom and two smaller bedrooms were intended to be inhabited by the nuclear family, LGBTQ people also inhabited and negotiated these spaces. And as Cook points out, we tend to forget that home has always been an important part of sexual minorities' identities. Though despite legal reforms in the UK that permit sexual minorities to set up home, such as the decriminalization of homosexuality and the legalization of civil unions and same-sex marriage, as images like this one show, much of society still envisions the home as a heteropatriarchal domain. Along with heteronormativity, queering is the other key component of my conceptual framework. I suggest queering is a process that and action that sexual minorities enact through the inhabitation of everyday domestic space. Intentional or not, homemaking practices and daily living are understood as the way in which heteronormativity might be challenged at home. Grammar is important when discussing the concept of queering. To emphasize that queering is a process, it is vital to use it in its verb form, that is, to queer or queering and queered. As an action, queering potentially allows an unrestricted group of subjectivities to take part without limiting membership or raising questions of authenticity. I argue queering is a process that is done to everyday spaces of home in an ongoing and continuous manner. Through drawing attention and visibility to everyday discrete homemaking practices, I borrow from the work of French philosopher Michel de Certeau, who similarly makes visible everyday systems of inhabiting life and its spaces. In his text, The Practice of Everyday Life, from 1984, de Certeau focuses on practices that happen in our everyday lives in order to show the generative power users have in creating space. Quotidian systems of inhabiting the everyday, he argues, work to reject the superstructure placed on us by society. His study is one which moves away from conventional figures that are believed to be the sole producers of space, city planners, policymakers, architects. Instead, he focuses on what he calls the consumers, or the occupants or inhabitants of everyday space. It is the actions of the consumers going about their daily lives that have the power to, quote, reappropriate the space organized by techniques of sociocultural production, end quote. I argue sexual minorities can especially benefit from a project that acknowledges agency for the consumers of everyday space. De Certeau uses the conceptual framework of strategies versus tactics in order to argue that practices of everyday life challenge the way space is perceived to be organized by producers. A strategy, he suggests, is the proper restricting order which begs for interaction from outside of it. In the context of my research, a strategy would be the structure of heteronormativity, which permeates all of society. In contrast, a tactic is a negotiation of the organizing regime, which cannot be pinpointed to one specific spatial or institutional localization. The place of the tactic belongs to the other, he suggests. Moreover, a tactic can be described as a process that constantly manipulates a calculated action. The notion of queering fits this definition of tactics. It is not a physical thing, but rather is enacted by participants where the heteronormative domestic environment is countered through daily practices of homemaking. While strategies like urban planning and the design of the built environment seek to control and restrict, consumers take a tactical nature and navigate space in ways that are freeing to the structure opposed on them. Through making visible the queering processes, my approach is one that allows the voice of the occupant and his or her domesticity to be conveyed to the reader. Thus, interviewing is the key methodology that allows me to foreground the subversive political activism apparent in tactically queering the home. Moreover, interviewing allows me to argue that queering takes place in extraordinary, complex, contradictory, and even subtle ways. My use of the acronym LGBTQ goes some way to acknowledging the complexity and multiplicity inherent in both sexuality and the queering process. Queering is not simply about making overt changes to home. Some LGBTQ Londoners visibly display their sexuality within the home, for example by putting up pictures of erotic art, or photographs of same-sex partners, or leaving out gay periodicals and books, while others do not. Notably, though, none of these instances of more visible queering included modifications to the building facade, or to the internal arrangement of the home. The architecture itself works as a container for the tactical display of queering heteronormativity. And now I just want to show you some of the images, participant-submitted images, and some qualitative data. And this is a quote from Jared. I've got a few other objects of interest, such as this one. It's pottery, it's glazed, and if you turn it over, it's got male genitalia engraved underneath. It's one of those things that you go, that's very nice, then you turn it over and go, ah. And this is a look into Devon's front corridor and his living room. It's not hard to pick out that a gay man lives here, particularly from the artwork. And during the interview, I asked the question that I asked everyone, if, say, an engineer was to come into the flat, would he or she know that you're a gay person? And he said, have you looked around? And there was a naked photograph behind me, a naked calendar. So, and then here's another example. This is from Gerard. I have a piece of art called The Diva of Lucca, which is by a fairly well-known artist that lives in Italy. I had a house in Italy, so I suppose you could say I was identifying myself with it because that was my name. And then from Dean, I suppose I identify being into opera to a certain degree with being gay. because there's this great gay following of opera with gay icons, thinking about Maria Callas, and there is a lot of diva-ishness with it all. 95% of my CDs are in opera or musicals, so you see I must be gay. In some ways, if you look around, it's kind of androgynous. We're not that girly, so we don't have anything pink or butterflies. From Ava. And then finally, from Janet, there are not any obvious things that we have that would identify us as a queer household. Janet. Out of the participants that foreground their sexuality at home, in all but one case this was done in what might be considered minor ways, which meant that queering could be removed out of sight with little effort. This flies in the face of much queer architectural scholarship, which suggests that there is a unified queer aesthetic, that in part consists of high modernist materials, including glass and mirrors. And I have a paper coming out, hopefully soon, in Home Cultures about this rather peculiar trend in architectural history. In addition, the queering done by those who foreground their sexuality was only done within the private space of the home, which admittedly may relate to notions of class respectability and decorum. Standing on the pavement facing the front facade, one is given no hint that a queer home exists beyond the front door. For instance, nobody flew a rainbow flag. Presenting queering home as internal to the building and therefore private does not mean the power to destabilize ideology remains indoors and muted. Feminist Carol Hainish's 1969 maxim, "The personal is political," has been taken up widely within feminist discourse. Many feminist writers have continued to follow Hainish's thinking by suggesting we take our politics with us as we navigate a path between both inside and outside of home. Human geographers Alison Blunt and Robin Dowling, for instance, observe that, quote, "Home is neither public nor private, but both. Home is not separated from public political worlds, but is constituted through them. The domestic is created through the extra-domestic, and vice versa," end quote. Architectural historians have also shown that interior domestic space is a representation of public, private, and personal notions of self. In other words, the divide between inside and outside is tenuous. Home is a porous site in which flows of information, people, and ideas pass back and forth across the threshold of the front door, as well as through technological communications like the internet, phone, and television. The increase in recent years of popular television sitcoms featuring gay and lesbian domestic spaces, which are watched not just in LGBTQ homes, is a clear example of this. Therefore, I would argue if public discourse can have an outside-in effect and shape normative concepts of home, then equally a study of queering home might work in some small way towards reforming normative ideals from inside out. LGBTQ homes exist alongside normalized understandings of home, but are not necessarily visible in the ways that queer scholarship has led us to expect. And in fact, many participants, notably older ones, feel this aspect of their identity is not displayed through homemaking processes. And here I just want to show you some more quotes. Jason notes, "I'm not convinced that my personal effects exhibit my sexuality. I'm sure if you walked into my house, you would know that there are two gay guys living there." And Sarah notes, "We're really not that gay at all, are we?" And her wife notes, we're shit gay people. We don't have time to be gay properly." And Peter notes, "We use very little, actually. We're not really that gay." And Eric suggests, "No, my home does not reflect our sexuality. I don't see how it could. For me, it's what you are as a person. Sexuality becomes far less important. We are in that wonderful situation where it has become accepted and we can lead an open life, and I don't have to parade the sexuality." To suggest sexuality is not that important, particularly at home, presents the deepest layer of complication to my argument that LGBTQ Londoners are queering the heteronormative home. These participants, who proudly identify with their sexual identity, but who have no need to relate to their sexuality in their homemaking processes, do enact same-sex desire and LGBTQ identity at home, i.e. they share a home with a partner, invite space into the family, invite friends and family into the space, or live as an out person. I contend that this offers a unique way to bring about change, by echoing heteronormative ideology while simultaneously and possibly unintentionally subverting it. Many of these participants insist that their home is the same as any other home, LGBTQ occupied or otherwise. Research participant Dale, for instance, emphasizes that his home is not some sort of 70s gay bar, it's just a house. I suggest these narratives not only show the varied ways identity plays out, but they work to challenge limiting views of queer domesticity held in society generally and in architectural literature specifically. Simply put, to show, for instance, that LGBTQ occupied homes might look not dissimilar to a straight home challenges presumptions on a number of levels. and it urges a more detailed investigation of the way multiple subject positions work to create space. Even the homes in my case studies that are clearly distinct, where sexual identity is most foregrounded, could easily be de-queered, and similarly any home, particularly if occupied in future by LGBTQ people, could easily be queered. Another example of the unstable and porous nature of the heteronormative British home. Since my research celebrates the varied ways Londoners are queering heteronormativity through homemaking processes, which includes some participants completely rejecting aspects of LGBTQ identity at home, in the remainder of this paper I want to position my work in a queer politic. Over the past 4 decades, the social acceptability of LGBTQ identity has improved dramatically in the West, particularly in some urban centres, including London. But these gains have created their own tensions. In particular, they have raised the concern that the queer political movement is becoming diffused, indistinct, and complacent, in a word, ordinary, thus risking the difficulties and struggles of those who have come before, that those who have become before will be forgotten. In the 1970s and 1980s, the queer political movement saw a public declaration of homosexuality, one that rejected heterosexuality and all its trappings. For many, this included conventional domesticity, marriage, monogamy, and respectability. In the face of the AIDS crisis and its widespread homophobic vitriol, however, the movement started to see a divergence. For advocacy groups like ACT UP, this meant more public radical demonstrations were needed. In their view, keeping quiet or being invisible is dangerous because it may lead to assimilation. Queer theorists started to investigate the question of assimilation and what it meant for the movement. Michael Warner was one of the first and leaders in this effort. In the 1990s, he argued that sexual minorities should reject marriage, reject assimilation, avoid becoming normal, and instead celebrate the things that have mattered to our collective gay past: public sex and decency and shame. Reflecting on the dangers of forgetting queer history has become a dominant theme of recent literature. Historians Christopher Castiglia and Christopher Reid suggest the price of assimilation is often forgetting the past, and this is problematic. And this is a block quote from them. The signs of these losses are everywhere: in the monopoly of gay marriage, in the assimilation of sexual minorities, and the subsequent abandonment of supposedly restrictive gay ghettos, in the insistent invisibility of AIDS or sexual liberation in popular media, in the dearth of radical public and collective challenges to mainstream institutions." End quote. I agree that it is important to remember the past, but one of the contentions I have with scholars that make this argument is the polarity of their approach. Even in their culturally sensitive approach, Castiglia and Reid hint that one is either for queer politics and a remembering of the past, or one is an assimilationist, against it and abandons its history by setting up a home and aspiring to normal sexuality and domesticity. They note, when young Americans today say that sexuality just doesn't matter, it's often heralded as a progressive triumph. But sexuality should matter. It should be the thrilling, dangerous, unpredictable, imaginative force it once was and no doubt still is. End quote. And then queer theorist David Halperin puts it in a similar way. He suggests, quote, "We are witnessing the rise of a new and vehement cult of gay ordinariness. Gay people lately have begun preening themselves on their dullness, commonness, averageness. A noticeable aggressiveness has started to inform their insistence on how boring they are, how conventional, how completely indistinguishable they are from everyone else." While I see the point that by overemphasizing fitting in, sexual minorities might reject the history that binds them, we can acknowledge that subjectivity and culture is incredibly complex. My look into 40 everyday London homes begins to illuminate just how complicated sexuality really is. The transition in the way sexuality is experienced in the West, which on the surface results in a loss of cohesion and forgetting of the past, is not something that needs to be lamented and feared, but rather it can be embraced for its advantages. In my view, it is necessary for queer theory to acknowledge and remember that there are a plurality of experiences of sexuality. My contention is that there needs to be room in queer theory and politics for a domestic approach, where LGBTQ identity at home is recognized. Similarly, if homemakers reject sexuality at home, as many did in this study, they must not be chastised. If queer, the identity construct, and the political movement, as I understand it, is about opening up, evolving, and accepting the diversity of the community, then there must be room for multiple trajectories, where politics is brought home to a wide variety of people. Thus, the politic of my focus is about multiplicity. We need to be able to fight for issues that affect the home, particularly for those people that are more domestically orientated, without casting them as assimilationist or normalizers. But equally, there needs to be sustained growth and on political issues that might seemingly play out beyond the front door. I argue there is now more than ever a need for multiple types of queer political activism, which is why my research aims to add another space to this agenda. To suggest one space or method of activism is more important than the other is besides the point. It is important to celebrate the multiplicity of minority sexualities and the spaces where identities unfold. Moreover, allowing diverse non-heterosexual identities to operate in parallel through multiple approaches can challenge heteronormativity in the most powerful way. By taking a domestic approach to queer politics, another potential criticism needs to be discussed. In some of the homes that I researched, I uncover the mundane ways in which LGBTQ Londoners queer heteronormativity. For some, these include the complete rejection of anything related to sexual identity in the homemaking process, wherein the home is asserted to be just like a normal home. Thus, one might wonder if LGBTQ identity is so subtle that it is no longer visible, and if people are not all out shouting in the streets, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it," but rather some prefer to be more domestic, what does that do for the community as a whole? What happens when the cohesiveness which existed back in the 1990s with regards to the AIDS backlash and the fight to overturn oppressive laws falls away and no longer binds the LGBT community together? While acknowledging these fears, my research aims to show the diversity of experiences and subjectivity that is at the heart of LGBTQ identity. That is not a weakness, that is. Theorist Alan Sinfield concedes, rather, quote, "The task is not to imagine an exclusive group of like-minded people, but to build on the diverse strengths of our constituency, to enlarge it and to politicize it," end quote. An argument which brings visibility to the internal and private act of queer heteronormativity at home might seem to work towards breaking down a noticeably cohesive community because it explores anonymous practices of inhabitation similar to that which LGBTQ Londoners were not so long ago forced to inhabit, and still must resort to in other parts of the world. This, however, is not at all my intention. I reiterate that I hope to expand on without distracting from the larger queer politic. I underscore that bringing queer politics home builds on the longer transition taking place. It is my hope that the strength of the argument lies in the aspiration to widen queer politics, to include a domestic approach. Moreover, I want to add to queer theory by embracing a multiplicity of identities and domestic arrangements, including those that fit with the mainstream representation. That is, to see all queer spaces and identities find wider acceptance in queer politics and society more generally. Although opening up queer politics and theory to the domestic is the main goal, secondary to that, and more modestly, such an approach could even aspire to contribute to social change in some small way for LGBTQ people, specifically by giving agency to the political act of homemaking and foregrounding the omnipotence of heteronormativity. My argument is built on the fact that home is a political site, as mentioned. There are two players in bringing this politics to light: the participants, the queers of heteronormative domestic space, and myself, the researcher, writer, and author, who draws attention to this activity and aims to give it agency. I assert that all ways in which heteronormativity is being queered, from the more obvious, such as displaying homoerotic artwork, to the subdued, living with a same-sex partner or inviting friends into one's home, are political acts. Even to reject sexuality altogether in the homemaking process, as some participants do, is a political act in and of itself, which results from the transition in queer politics over the past 4 decades. I further admit that it is possible that some participants who maintain that their LGBTQ identity has nothing to do with their home may reject my assertion that their home or their homemaking is political. Following de Certeau, a key part of the political nature of my research is to make visible everyday acts of inhabiting space. And this may also result in participants disliking my insistence upon seeing heteronormativity everywhere and my belief that it continues to shape all experiences of home. But along with TV, internet, and phone offering entrance points, something as simple as a repair engineer coming in to the home to fix an appliance, or a government volunteer knocking at the door to collect statistics would show that no home goes untouched by heteronormativity. Because not everyone has the luxury or aspiration of rejecting aspects of their sexuality at home, celebrating the political agency of homemaking that challenges the all-encompassing nature of heteronormativity is important. Even though some interviewees are not engaging in politics does not mean the need for activism, political activism disappears. there is a continuous need to improve equality for all people, all sexual minorities at home and beyond. Showing the complexity of LGBTQ identity at home is inspired by my desire to see queer politics be recognized as less peripheral to the heterosexual majority and to sexual minorities that are more domestically oriented. As suggested by now, I feel the home is an important space for queer activism. Another aim of my research is to work towards destabilizing stereotypes surrounding queer domesticity. Thus, my research focuses on everyday practices and lived experiences of a select group of Londoners, which moves away from monolithic representations which normative ideologies work to construct. I am not alone in looking at ordinary space in order to destabilize stereotypes and ideologies. In 1994, the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York held what was arguably the first exhibition and academic spatial theorizing of LGBTQ identity, fittingly called Queer Space. To celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall Inn Uprising, which some believe started the gay rights movement in America, the organizers of Queer Space arranged for 13 projects to be shown in its gallery, which would, quote, open up the question of queer space rather than pin it down, end quote. Further, the aim of the exhibition was to generate new ways of thinking about the social politics of space in the city, as well as to question stereotypes and prejudices. Although only one of the entries looked to the domestic sphere, what it set out to do was commendable, especially given the political outrage that dominated the mid-1990s activism. In their Family Values project, architects Benjamin Gianni and Mark Robbins solicited snapshots of domestic spaces through gay periodicals in Ottawa, Ontario, and Columbus, Ohio. The project overview noted that the photographs work to break down myths associated with queer domesticity. The photos allow us to explore and explode stereotypes about the gay community, who we are, and how we live, they note. Unfortunately, I couldn't grab any photographs from interior spaces. Though through the display of domestic scenes, Gianni and Robbins conclude that the majority of gay people live among their heterosexual neighbors. Some of us react against normative symbols of domesticity, others of us embrace them. The quotidian de-eroticization of queerness and banality of domesticity was celebrated in the reviews of the project, similar to the ways in which these issues are celebrated in my own research. In Architecture of the Everyday, architectural historian Stephen Harris observes, quote, by documenting the private, ordinary realm of the everyday lives of purportedly extraordinary people, homosexuals, the project offers a view of marginalized domesticity and demonstrates that the often banal character of the unauthorized. In their discussion of the project, Castiglia and Reed, however, note that the eclectic interior decorating and high design can be found in the photographs, which draw on a history of gay domesticity as unique, and they suggest distinct and separate from normative domesticity. Not surprisingly, these authors critique the project and the celebration of invisibility of queerness in the built environment as evidence of the triumph of assimilation. While Castiglia and Reed believe that we need to avoid invisibility at all costs in an effort to remain exceptional sexualities, as suggested, my position is that queer politics and LGBTQ identity is much more varied than that. And in some of the interviews with Londoners, notions of invisibility certain work to construct queer domesticity. In drawing this paper to a close, I want to quote the New York journalist and music critic Alex Ross, who recently published an article about the changing nature of queer politics. I share his opinion that sees the critique of domesticity as intriguing but ultimately limiting. Indeed, this explains why I dwelled on what seems like potential critiques in order to situate my research in the long transition of queer politics. And Ross explains, quote, the queer ethos has its own confinements, its own essentialism. The implication is that anyone who goes in for marriage is betraying the bohemian essence of gayness. Both sides of the debate tend to reduce the dizzying variety of LGBTQ lives to an ideal condition. Either you're prowling in the bars or you're gardening in the Berkshires. It is possible to do both, or perhaps to transition gently from one to the other as time goes by. Following Ross, it is my hope that my research offers a new approach to queer theory by showing the diversity of LGBTQ identity at home and the multiple ways heteronormativity is being queered in London. And part of this is celebrating the contradictory ways sexuality plays out. With a political argument, I make the case that those who reject sexuality in the homemaking process are not assimilationists or abandoners of a queer studies project of challenging heteronormativity. Rather, they contribute to this in more complex ways, urging change in more subdued form, but which can be just as political. The point was brought up in 2 interviews with older gay Londoners, whose quote I want to end with. Like my aspirational goal to see queer queried, Eric notes he and his partner prefer to campaign for social equality in an alternative way, through living their everyday lives. I believe spreading tolerance in the sense that I'd rather people take us as we are, for what we are, as opposed to forcing the issue. I've never been in the situation where I want that confrontation. I appreciate the good these upfront campaigners have done for the cause and how brave some of them have been by waving the flag, etc. But that would never have been my style of doing it. I feel tolerance and acceptability can be spread in another way, which is slightly more subtle but just as important. And finally, Basil notes, we are really advocates of, between inverted commas, normalizing the whole thing, because it's part of everyday life. Thank you.